Hello, everybody. My name is Jared, and the book I chose is Slaughterhouse Five, written by the German-American author Kurt Vonnegut Jr. Now, Kurt Vonnegut Jr. is a writer of science fiction, satire, and black humor who was born in 1922. The author's works frequently address themes such as science and technology going awry, such as in the novel Player Piano in 1952, where there's this supercomputer that's very similar to Maniac, who helped create the atomic bomb. But one of his most famous works of all time is the sci-fi anti-war novel known as Slaughterhouse Five, which was written in 1969. It's famous for its use of science fiction to both explain the absurdity of war and the effect war can bring upon others, such as PTSD and other forms of trauma. Vonnegut was well known for being able to explain and critique human phenomenon in the 20th century via science fiction and fantasy to get his anti-war message across. Though many describe his writing style as wry and cynical, based on how he describes human society in many of his books, I find that the way he explains a lot of the stuff he does in Slaughterhouse Five, while it is very non-linear, it does sort of help paint the picture of what was going on at the time, even though it's only a science fiction novel. It's sort of also steeped in Kurt Vonnegut's actual experiences, though we will get to that later in the video. So, about the novel. The novel is more or less Kurt Vonnegut's retelling of the bombing of Dresden, but through the eyes of the book's main character, Billy Pilgrim. See, Kurt Vonnegut is blending his real-life perception of the events that took place in Dresden as a prisoner of war, and the sci-fi element that is Billy Pilgrim being unstuck in time. So while it is still science fiction, it retains some of how the author recalled the tragedy himself. So there is some sort of real-life element to it, but it's told through the eyes of a fictional character and through fictional means, such as being unstuck. Billy Pilgrim being unstuck in time is actually, in my view, Kurt explaining trauma due to the bombing, such as I say trauma, I actually mean PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, for those who don't know the anagram. And my ethical principle for this is cultural relativism and deontology on how Billy Pilgrim's daughter, named Barbara, handled her traumatized father. Now, before we begin to fully understand Billy Pilgrim's ethical dilemma, we must first understand how Billy being unstuck in time is a reference to him trying to cope with his PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder, as I said earlier. Many who suffer from trauma during war or a catastrophic event have increased chance of developing PTSD in life and will relive that moment in their lives forever, or at least for an extremely long time. There's not really a set cure for it, but there are treatments. When Billy Pilgrim goes unstuck in time, he can go into the future in 1960s America. He goes to the alien world of Tralfamadore and the farther future, where he's the president, he gets assassinated, stuff that happens normally in the future. Just bear with me. It's important. But most importantly, he goes to Dresden in 1945. No matter where Billy time jumps to, he always ends up back in Dresden, the source of his wartime trauma. While he does deal with his trauma, he still successfully leads a normal life. He opens a business, which is optometry. He gets married. He has a child named Barbara and I think a son named Robert. He does, however, suffer a head injury due to a plane crash that makes him a widower. And he's almost entirely house-ridden, except for a time where he goes to New York and hosts and is a guest on late night radio where he talks about Tralfamadore and what their views on time and how to cope with certain things as well, such as only focusing on the happy moments of life. This is where Barbara comes in. The secondary focus of Billy's ethical dilemma and the primary focus of the ethical principle of cultural relativism and deontology is through Barbara. While she isn't a main focus in the book entirely, she will help us try to understand how mental health was treated in the 60s, as well as what was her duty in that situation based on how she actually handled her father's mental health. So before we dive into the deep end of this ethical dilemma, we must look at the ethical principles of cultural relativism and deontology, to bring us closer to understanding the point of this argument. Because without understanding the point, this is just me rambling for about 7 to 10 minutes. That's not fun for anybody. Through the eyes of a cultural relativist, Barbara's actions, or suggested action in this case, in one case I will bring up later, not this case, should be understood through the beliefs, the values, and practices of her culture, which is late 60s America, since this is when issues of Billy's mental health and state of mind are brought into question. We shouldn't judge Barbara's actions and comments about her father based on how we handle mental health now, because our modern day culture for handling mental health is different than how they handled mental health in the 60s. So basically, we're focusing on how like her culture, her 1960s culture, dealt with her father's mental health. What was the norm for dealing with somebody with mental health back in the day? We'll next look at deontology, which literally means duty in Greek. Is it duty? Is the study of nature of duty and obligation. So the direction we are heading is based on the sensibilities of the late 60s, is what Barbara suggests to be done with her father, the right course of duty one would propose as someone living during that time period. So, does what her culture says is the right thing to do and what she says is the right thing to do those match up with how the 60s handles mental health or her culture? See, what we're mainly looking at is what is Barbara's duty in this situation with Billy, his trauma, and his advanced age. While Billy does have a caretaker, we barely even see them in the novel, so they aren't noteworthy variable. So, caretaker. You are not special. Yeah. No, Barbara is the main person responsible for her father in this situation. Now, where relativism comes in is what can be used to explain how issues of mental health were handled in that time period, During the early 20th century, a bit of history for y'all. During the early 20th century, the main way of dealing with people with mental health, among other things that shall not be named due to graphic nature, was to isolate them and put them in lunatic asylums. This isn't actually a new practice at this time period, due to them being around as early as the 17th century. But they didn't fall out of popular use until the 50s and 90s. Now, I mentioned these two because these are where two waves of deinstitutionalization was starting to get more popular. So, this is an example of what these insane asylums looked like. So, it really wasn't a nice place to be. Barbara proposes something similar to this in the novel when Billy ticks off Barbara by not answering the door. Literal quote from the novel, quote, "What are we going to do with you? Are you going to force us to put you where your mother is?" End quote. Now, Billy's mother doesn't live in an asylum, true. She lives in an old person's home, or senior home, or whatever you want to call it. It's where old people are isolated from society. But the theme of isolation due to questions of his mental health and the question of is he senile or not are still present. And Barbara feels that it is her duty to help Billy if he won't help himself in this case. And he doesn't feel like he has. And she goes to the simple cultural solution of isolating Billy from the rest of society. Like, hey, if you're not willing to help yourself, I'm just going to do what's appropriate nowadays and just send you off and be isolated and be around other old people for the rest of your life, so you stay away from society and stop shaming our family name, that kind of thing. Very nice, very nice. This doesn't at first seem very fair to Billy, because if we look at Tralfamadore and the Tralfamadorians as a coping mechanism for the PTSD he suffers, then he has in his own mind already found a solution to his problem through the Tralfamadorians. Through the Tralfamadorians, Billy learns to focus on the happy moments in time rather than the unpleasant ones. This is the solution that Billy has found for himself. Though since her daughter denounces this as insanity, and like, dude, you're crazy, this is not real, your aliens aren't real, and you're just making this up, Billy really doesn't totally have a say in where he goes at that point, even though According to him, he has already found the solution to not only his woes, but society's as well. Like, he proposes, if people just learn to look through the lens of a Tralfamadorian, learn to see and try to comprehend 3 dimensions or 4 dimensions, then all of life's worries will be solved. Simple, right? Now, from a culturally relativist look of the time period they are in, which is the late 60s, this still wouldn't be considered abnormal treatment of the senile or mentally ill in America in this time. So, from a cultural standpoint, Barbara was in the right for trying to treat her father this way. It's on her duty. She needs to either isolate her father or find some other means of treating her father. And since those treatments that shall not be named, such as lobotomy, aren't really a great option in this case, she chooses to instead isolate her father from the rest of society. As a suggestion or an offhand remark, this doesn't really happen in the book, and it isn't a main part of the book anyways, but her suggestion of wanting to do this is relevant in this case. So, to recap, earlier in this video, we looked at the ethical dilemma of Barbara's treatment of Billy due to her suggestion of sending him to a retirement home, practically isolating him from the rest of the world. We also looked at how Billy being unstuck in time was a metaphor for his PTSD, and the Tralfamadorians being how he copes with trauma, and through Tralfamador, and through their philosophy on time. I conclude that from a culturally relativistic standpoint, Barbara did think of the culturally appropriate solution for the time, even though the book doesn't really play out that way in long term due to time jumps in Billy's future. But anyways, that's just a theory. A book theory. Any questions? Any questions?